The moment my parents stood up during my wedding rehearsal, the entire ballroom went silent. My mother pointed at my grandfather's name on the head table and said, "Remove him. He's just a retired janitor. He's embarrassing this family." Grandpa quietly reached for his jacket, ready to leave without saying a word. I stopped him. His seat stays. My parents grabbed their things and walked out, promising they'd never attend my wedding. I thought that was the end of it. I had no idea that less than 24 hours later, my father's CEO would stand, look directly at Grandpa, and say 4 words that destroyed every lie my parents had ever built. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 30 years old, and I work as an event planner in Chicago. After spending years organizing other people's perfect weddings, I never imagined mine would become the day my own family nearly fell apart before it even began. The rehearsal dinner was held inside a beautiful lakeside ballroom overlooking Lake Michigan. My fiancé, Michael, was greeting relatives while I made one final check of the seating chart. Every name had been placed carefully, especially one. Grandpa Walters. His seat was beside mine at the head table. To anyone else, he was simply a retired school janitor who had spent over 40 years cleaning classrooms, polishing hallways, and fixing broken desks. To me, he was the man who had quietly shown up every single time life became difficult. When my parents worked endless hours chasing promotions and business success, Grandpa was the one who walked me to school, attended every recital, packed every lunch, and never missed a birthday. He never complained about the sacrifices he made. He simply loved me without expecting anything in return. I looked across the ballroom and smiled as Grandpa slowly adjusted his old navy blue suit. It wasn't expensive, but he'd had it professionally cleaned and pressed for the occasion. He looked nervous, almost like he wasn't sure he belonged. Before I could walk over, my father's voice echoed across the room. "What is this?" Everyone stopped talking. He stood beside the seating chart, staring directly at Grandpa's name. "Why is Walter sitting at the head table?" I answered calmly, "Because that's exactly where I want him." My mother's expression immediately hardened. "Emily, don't do this tonight." Dad lowered his voice, but not enough to keep nearby guests from hearing. "My CEO is attending tomorrow. So are half the executive team. Do you honestly expect us to explain why a retired janitor is sitting beside the bride?" The word janitor hung in the air like an insult. Grandpa quietly reached for his cane. "It's all right," he said softly. "I can sit anywhere." "No," I answered immediately. Dad folded his arms. "Either you move him, or your mother, and I won't be part of this wedding." The ballroom fell completely silent. I looked at my parents, then at the man who had spent decades putting everyone else before himself. There wasn't even a decision to make. "If Grandpa moves," I said, meeting my father's eyes, "then I'm canceling the wedding before I let anyone disrespect him." My parents stared at me in disbelief. Without another word, they picked up their coats and walked out of the ballroom, leaving stunned guests whispering behind them. As the doors closed, I turned toward Grandpa. He looked heartbroken. What I couldn't understand was why my father's CEO seemed to matter more to them than the man who had spent his entire life protecting this family. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my parents walking out of the ballroom while Grandpa stood there pretending their words hadn't hurt him. But I'd known him my entire life. Walter Carter could hide pain better than anyone I'd ever met. The next morning, sunlight filled the small guest suite where Grandpa was getting ready. When I knocked, he smiled like nothing had happened. "Come in, sweetheart." His navy suit was already pressed, and he was carefully pinning a small medal inside the jacket pocket. I'd never seen it before. "Grandpa, what's that?" He looked down, hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Oh, just something from a long time ago." Curious, I noticed an old leather box sitting open beside him. Inside were several faded photographs. One showed Grandpa standing beside men in military uniforms. Another showed him shaking hands with someone wearing a business suit outside an old factory. "Why have I never seen these?" I asked. He quietly closed the box. "Some memories don't need to be displayed to matter." That answer only made me more curious. Before I could ask another question, my phone buzzed. My mother's name flashed across the screen. I answered. Emily, there's still time, she said immediately. Move your grandfather before the ceremony. Your father and I will pretend none of yesterday happened. And if I don't? There was a long silence. Then you'll regret embarrassing this family. I ended the call without another word. Grandpa had heard enough to understand. He slowly reached into his jacket and handed me a sealed envelope with my name written across the front. If you ever want answers about this family, he said gently, open this after the wedding. I stared at the envelope. Answers to what? He simply smiled. After today. Nothing more. The ceremony venue slowly filled with guests dressed in elegant suits and formal gowns. As Michael greeted arriving relatives, I noticed something strange. Several executives from my father's company walked past him with polite smiles, but their eyes kept drifting toward Grandpa. Some looked surprised. Others looked almost respectful. None of it made sense. Then the ballroom entrance opened again. A tall man stepped inside, surrounded by several senior executives. My father immediately hurried over to greet him. It was his CEO. But halfway across the room, the CEO suddenly stopped walking. His eyes locked on Grandpa. For several long seconds, he didn't say a single word. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Despite everything that had happened, Michael and I exchanged our vows surrounded by friends, relatives, and guests who applauded as we were pronounced husband and wife. My parents attended, but only because leaving would have created an even bigger scene. They barely looked at Grandpa once. During the reception, everyone settled into their seats while the band played softly in the background. I noticed my father constantly glancing toward his CEO, almost as if he was worried something unexpected might happen. He had no idea how right he was. After the best man's toast, the master of ceremonies invited my father's CEO to say a few words. The room grew quiet. Instead of walking toward the microphone, the CEO stepped away from the stage and slowly crossed the ballroom. Every guest turned to watch him. He stopped directly in front of Grandpa. Grandpa looked genuinely confused. The CEO smiled, his eyes already beginning to glisten. Then he spoke 4 quiet words. Sir, you saved me. A wave of confusion swept across the ballroom. Nobody moved. Nobody even whispered. I looked toward my father. The color had completely drained from his face. The CEO gently shook Grandpa's hand before turning toward the guests. Most of you know me as Daniel Brooks, CEO of Harrison Industrial Group, he began. But 25 years ago, I was a frightened young maintenance trainee working 2 jobs just to keep my family afloat. He looked back at Grandpa. Walter Carter noticed I skipped lunch almost every day. One afternoon, he asked why. The CEO smiled sadly. I admitted I couldn't afford both food and the certification classes I needed to qualify for promotions. The ballroom remained perfectly silent. He disappeared for a few days, the CEO continued. Then he handed me an envelope containing enough money to pay every remaining class fee. Grandpa lowered his eyes, clearly uncomfortable. I tried to repay him years later, the CEO said. He refused every penny. Instead, Grandpa quietly answered, just help someone else when you can. The CEO nodded. I've spent the last 25 years trying to honor that promise. Then he looked directly at my father. I believe everyone here deserves to know the rest of this story. My father's hands tightened around his glass. For the first time all weekend, he looked genuinely afraid of what was about to be revealed. The CEO slowly faced the guests again before turning toward my father. There is one part of the story that Michael, Emily, and everyone else deserves to hear. My father's eyes dropped to the floor. 25 years ago, the CEO explained, my father had nearly dropped out of college after my grandparents faced serious financial hardship. Tuition bills were overdue, loans had been denied, and my father's future looked uncertain. Walter never told anyone, the CEO said quietly. But he worked extra evening shifts, saved every dollar he could, and personally covered thousands of dollars of your son's education. The ballroom became perfectly still. I turned toward my father. His face was frozen. I know this because I delivered one of those envelopes myself, the CEO continued. Walter asked me never to tell anyone. He said a father's pride mattered more than receiving credit. My mother's eyes filled with tears. Dad finally looked at Grandpa. "You promised," he whispered. Grandpa nodded gently. "I did. And I kept that promise." The CEO sighed. "But today, after hearing you call the man who sacrificed for your future an embarrassment, I couldn't stay silent anymore." Nobody at the reception spoke. Several guests quietly lowered their heads. Others stared at Grandpa with a respect that hadn't been there only minutes earlier. Grandpa slowly stood, leaning on his cane. "I didn't help anyone because I expected applause," he said calmly. "I helped because someone once helped me when I needed it most." He looked directly at my parents. "I never cared what job any person had. Character always mattered more." My father's shoulder slumped. For the first time in my life, he looked like a little boy standing before the man who had loved him unconditionally. He walked toward Grandpa with tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I spent years chasing titles and forgot the person who gave me the chance to earn one." Grandpa placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I forgave you long before you asked." The reception slowly returned to life, but nothing felt the same anymore. Guests who had barely noticed Grandpa when they arrived now lined up to shake his hand. Some thanked him for his kindness. Others simply smiled, unable to find the right words. My father waited until everyone had stepped away. Then he hugged Grandpa tightly. "I spent years trying to impress people who barely knew my name," he said quietly. "The one man who deserved my respect was standing beside me all along." Grandpa smiled the same gentle smile I'd known since childhood. It's never too late to choose humility. Later that evening, after Michael and I said goodbye to our guests, I remembered the sealed envelope Grandpa had given me that morning. I carefully opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. It wasn't about money, family secrets, or hidden success. Instead, Grandpa had written one simple message. People will always judge others by titles, salaries, or appearances. Don't make that mistake. Build your family around kindness, because long after careers end, kindness is the only thing people truly remember. I read the letter twice before quietly folding it back into the envelope. As photographers gathered us for one final family picture, I walked over to Grandpa and took his arm. "This is where you belong," I whispered. He smiled as we stood together at the center of the family. A few weeks later, I framed that wedding photograph and hung it in our home. Whenever someone visits, they usually notice Grandpa's warm smile before anything else. And every time I look at that picture, I remember the greatest lesson I received on my wedding day. A person's job may tell you how they earn a living, but their character tells you how they change the world.